The air inside the precinct station was a closed system, a carefully curated atmosphere of recycled coolness, and the lingering, sterile scent of industrial cleaning agents. It was an environment designed to suppress variables, to create a predictable baseline against which the chaotic narratives of the city could be measured and catalogued. Fluorescent lights, humming at a frequency just below conscious perception, cast a flat, shadowless illumination upon the polished linoleum floors, the beige cinder block walls, and the worn formica countertops. The only sounds were the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard, the low, steady drone of a server rack in a back room, and the periodic, staticky sigh of the dispatch radio, a voice from the outside world speaking in codes and clipped professional cadences. It was a space defined by its regularity, a bulwark of order against the unpredictable night. Into this meticulously maintained equilibrium, an agent of pure, unscripted biology intruded. It was a dog, a creature of indeterminate breed, its coat a matted tapestry of urban survival, its frame lean with the efficiency of perpetual motion. It did not bark or whine, its entry was a quiet assertion of presence, a fluid movement through the automatic doors that had hissed open for a departing officer moments before. The animal's claws made a soft, scratching sound on the floor, a tiny, organic disruption to the station's mechanical pulse. It was not the dog itself that first drew the focused attention of the two officers at the front desk, but the object it pulled behind it. A black plastic garbage bag, heavy and misshapen, was clenched in its jaws. The bag scraped along the floor with a dry, rustling friction, a sound that was fundamentally alien to this environment. It was the sound of detritus, of things discarded and forgotten, now dragged into a place dedicated to memory and record. The dog, seemingly oblivious to the strangeness of its own action, proceeded with a placid determination, its path unwavering as it moved towards the center of the lobby. It stopped directly under the brightest panel of lights, released its burden with a soft thud, and then sat, its tail giving a single, tentative thump against the floor. It looked at the officers, not with expectation or fear, but with a calm, neutral gaze, as if it had simply completed a task it did not understand but knew to be necessary. The two officers, a veteran named Miller and a younger officer, Chen, exchanged a look that was less alarm and more a weary, late-night curiosity. This was an anomaly, but a minor one, a small, nonsensical story to be told at the end of shift. Miller rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, a physical representation of the procedural caution that governed his profession. He approached the animal not as a threat, but as a piece of misplaced evidence. The dog did not flinch. It simply watched, a silent, living courier, its purpose fulfilled. Miller circled the bag, his eyes tracing its lumpy, asymmetrical form. Chen remained at the desk, his fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to log the event, to translate this small moment of strangeness into the formal, unambiguous language of a police report. The bag was standard municipal issue, thin and black, its surface scuffed and streaked with grime from its journey. A small tear near the top revealed nothing but darkness within. The knot was tight, a simple, functional closure. Following protocol, Miller put on a pair of disposable latex gloves, the snap of the plastic against his skin a sharp, punctuating sound in the quiet room. He crouched, his knees cracking softly. The dog watched him, its head tilted. It was not guarding the bag, its posture was one of release, of consignment. With practiced fingers, Miller worked at the knot, teasing the stretched plastic apart. Chen leaned forward, his interest piqued beyond the need for documentation. There was no discernible odor, none of the decay or chemical signature one might associate with discarded waste. The bag opened not with a rush of air, but with a soft exhalation, as if it had been holding its breath. Miller pulled the edges apart, creating a dark crater in the plastic. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry leaves and city dust, was a single object. It was a rock, or something that presented as one. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a human skull, and its surface was a complex mosaic of textures and colors. It was not a homogeneous stone. One hemisphere was a dark, obsidian-like material, polished to a dull sheen and pockmarked with tiny, shallow craters. This dark glass seemed to swaddle the other half, which was a startlingly different, crystalline structure. It was a chaotic lattice of interlocking, geometric shards, some a milky white, others a deep, translucent violet, all of them catching the flat fluorescent light and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny, internal reflections. Running between these two distinct halves was a vein, a jagged, incandescent line of what looked like fused metal, a coppery gold that seemed to pulse with a faint, residual warmth, though when Miller tentatively touched it with a gloved finger, it was cold. He and Chen stared. It was this object that began the silence. It was not the silence of shock that follows a gruesome discovery, but a deeper, more profound quiet. It was the silence that arises from a failure of category. The object was not evidence of a crime. It was not garbage. It was not a natural geological formation they could recognize. It was utterly, authoritatively itself, a thing that defied their lexicon of experience. Miller slowly, carefully, lifted it from the bag. It was unexpectedly dense, its mass far greater than its volume suggested. He placed it on the countertop, the heavy, solid sound of its contact with the formica echoing in the still air. The dog its delivery made, stood up, shook its body once from nose to tail, and trotted silently back out through the automatic doors, disappearing into the night as unobtrusively as it had arrived, leaving behind a question made manifest in stone and light. The object sat on the counter, an island of profound mystery in a sea of beige bureaucracy. For a time, the two officers simply observed it, their procedural instincts momentarily paralyzed by an absence of context. Their training provided a flowchart for almost any eventuality, a weapon, a body, a suspicious substance, but there was no protocol for this. The object exerted a strange gravity, pulling their attention into its intricate details. The dark, glassy portion seemed to drink the light, its surface a record of ancient impacts, each tiny pit a scar from a history they could not imagine. In contrast, the crystalline half was a riot of internal geometry, a frozen explosion of structure. It was as if two entirely different realities, two opposing principles of formation, had been forced into a violent and beautiful union. Miller, recovering his professional composure, decided to treat it as he would any piece of unclassified evidence. He photographed it from every angle, the clinical flash of the camera washing over its surfaces, each picture a sterile attempt to capture something that felt fundamentally irreducible. They weighed it. The scale read 386 kilograms, a density that was baffling, suggesting a composition rich in heavy elements, far beyond ordinary terrestrial rock. A preliminary scan with a handheld radiation detector yielded nothing, a flat, steady click that only deepened the enigma. It was inert, yet it felt intensely active, its complex form implying a dynamic and violent origin. They called in a geologist from the local university, a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne, waking her in the dead of night with a request so strange she initially assumed it was a prank. When she arrived, her expression of weary skepticism dissolved into the same quiet awe that had settled over the officers. She ran a gloved hand over the object's surface, her touch both clinical and reverent. She recognized elements of its structure, but never in such a configuration. The glassy material, she explained, was a form of tektite, terrestrial rock melted and thrown into the upper atmosphere by a massive impact, then cooled rapidly as it fell back to Earth. But its chemical signature, analyzed with a portable spectrometer she brought, was subtly wrong. It contained trace elements, isotopes of xenon and neodymium, in ratios that did not correspond to any known terrestrial or even solar system source. The crystalline portion was even more perplexing. It was a silicate matrix, but the crystals were too perfect, too large, their growth uninterrupted by the usual geological constraints. They spoke of formation in a low-gravity, slow-cooling environment, something not found on or even inside a planet like Earth. It was the vein of metal between the two halves that offered the most profound clue. It was not copper or gold, but an alloy of iron and nickel, laced with iridium, platinum, and other siderophile, or iron-loving, elements. This was the unmistakable signature of a meteorite, the core material of a differentiated asteroid or planetesimal. But this metallic vein was not merely attached, it was woven into both the tektite and the crystal, a binding agent that had fused them together in an event of unimaginable heat and pressure. Thorne hypothesized that they were looking at a chimera, an object with a story written in 3 distinct languages of physics. The crystalline structure was the original object, something formed in the vacuum of space. The metal was part of its core. The tektite glass was the Earth's own crust, melted and fused to the visitor upon its cataclysmic arrival. The silence in the room deepened, but now it was tinged with understanding. They were not looking at a rock, they were looking at the point of collision between two worlds. They were witnesses to the preserved instant of an ancient impact, a moment of planetary trauma frozen and held in their hands. The object was a scar, a memory of a day when the sky fell, a day long before any human eyes existed to see it. To comprehend the object's terrestrial sheath, the dark, glassy skin that comprised half its mass, one must discard the human conception of time, and adopt the patient, inexorable timescale of geology. The narrative of this glass began not with the object's arrival, but deep within the Earth's own history, in the Proterozoic Eon, more than 1 billion years before the present. At that time, the landmasses of the planet were coalescing into the supercontinent of Rodinia, a vast, arid expanse of rock and microbial life. The region where the police station would one day stand was then submerged beneath a shallow, primordial sea, a chemical broth rich in dissolved silica and iron. For millions upon millions of years, the slow, silent rain of microscopic skeletons and volcanic dust settled on the seabed, accumulating layer by infinitesimal layer. Each layer was a page in a diary written in sediment, recording the subtle shifts in ocean chemistry, the faint variations in sunlight, the patient rhythm of a world without seasons as we know them. The pressure grew immense. Kilometers of sediment accumulated above, compressing the lower layers with a weight that defies intuitive grasp. Water was squeezed out, and the loose grains of silica and clay were forced together, beginning a slow, crystalline transformation. This was the birth of shale and sandstone, the foundational rock of the continent. This process continued for an incomprehensible duration. Continents drifted, mountains rose and fell, and life experimented with its first multicellular forms in the sunlit waters far above. The rock lay in darkness, changing under the influence of heat and pressure, its constituent minerals recrystallizing into new, more stable forms. It became a metamorphic rock, a schist, its structure foliated and aligned by the tectonic stresses that were slowly tearing the supercontinent apart. This rock, this specific section of Earth's crust, held within its crystalline matrix the isotopic memory of its ancient environment. It contained the precise ratio of oxygen isotopes that spoke of the temperature of that long-vanished sea. It held trace amounts of carbon that were the fossilized remnants of cyanobacteria, the organisms that were then slowly, painstakingly oxygenating the planet's atmosphere, paving the way for all complex life to come. It was a silent, patient witness, entombed miles beneath the surface. And then, the visitor arrived. The object from space, the crystalline and metallic core, struck this exact location with a velocity measured in tens of kilometers per second. The energy released in that instant was orders of magnitude greater than the planet's entire nuclear arsenal. The impact did not simply create a crater, it was an act of geological creation and annihilation. The target rock, the ancient Proterozoic schist, was vaporized and melted in less than a second. A plume of incandescent rock and plasma was ejected high into the atmosphere, breaching the thin veil of air and reaching the cold vacuum of space. There, in the brief, weightless moments of its ballistic trajectory, the molten droplets of Earth rock cooled with phenomenal speed. There was no time for crystals to form. The atoms were frozen in place, creating a disordered, amorphous solid, a natural glass or tektite. It was during this fiery birth that the molten Earth material encountered and fused with the surviving fragments of the impactor. The liquid schist flowed around the violet crystals and the metallic core, enveloping them in a sheath of dark, terrestrial glass. The object that fell back to Earth was no longer two separate things, but a single, composite entity, a violent marriage of the terrestrial and the extraterrestrial. It was a new kind of rock, born from a singular, catastrophic event, its dark skin a memorial to a piece of the Earth that had been blasted into the sky and returned, utterly transformed. Within the fused chimera on the counter, the crystalline half told a story that began far beyond the confines of Earth's gravity, in a place and time profoundly alien. Dr. Thorne's portable instruments could only hint at its nature, but they were sufficient to identify the core anomaly, the detail that elevated the object from a geological curiosity to a cosmic artifact of the highest importance. The analysis of the metallic vein confirmed its meteoritic origin, but the isotopic ratios of elements like osmium and tungsten within the metal were perplexing. They did not align with the signatures of chondrites or iron meteorites from our own solar system's asteroid belt. They suggested an origin in a protoplanetary disk with a fundamentally different chemical composition, a nebula seeded by a different mix of stellar forebears. This was a guest, not just from space but from another star system. The violet crystals were the true messengers. Spectrometry revealed them to be a form of silicate, but one containing inclusions of other, rarer minerals. Trapped within the perfect crystal lattices were microscopic grains of silicon carbide and graphite. These were not just minerals, they were time capsules. Under a powerful microscope, one could see that these grains were older than the silicate that encased them. They were pre-solar grains, specks of dust forged in the atmospheres of long-dead stars, stars that had lived and died before our own sun had even begun to coalesce from its natal cloud. Each grain was a fossil from a star. By analyzing the isotopic composition of the carbon and silicon within these grains, one could reconstruct the type of star that had created them. Some pointed to carbon-rich asymptotic giant branch stars, slow-burning red giants that puffed their outer layers into space. Others, containing traces of exotic isotopes like calcium-44, could only have been formed in the heart of a core collapse supernova, a cataclysmic explosion of a star more than 8 times the mass of our Sun. The object on the counter was not just a rock, it was an archive. It was a fragment of a planetesimal that had formed in a solar system born from the ashes of multiple, ancient stellar generations. It carried the chemical fingerprints of stars that no longer existed, their light having faded from the cosmos billions of years ago. The silence in the police station was now the silence of scale. The officers, Miller and Chen, listened as Thorne spoke, her voice low and steady, translating the language of isotopes and minerals into a narrative of cosmic history. The fluorescent lights of the station seemed to dim, the beige walls to recede, replaced by a vision of a swirling nebula of gas and dust, seeded with the diamond-hard grains of expired stars. They were touching a piece of a world that had formed around a different sun, a world that had likely been destroyed billions of years ago, its parent star perhaps now a white dwarf or a neutron star, a cold stellar corpse haunting a distant arm of the galaxy. The stray dog had not just brought in a piece of trash. It had delivered a relic, a tangible piece of another, lost creation story, a testament to the fact that the processes that formed our world are not unique, that the cosmos is filled with the ghosts of solar systems past. To truly grasp the origin of the object's core, one's perspective must expand beyond solar systems, beyond even the local stellar neighborhood, and focus upon a single, colossal star that ignited in the early universe. This was a population-2 star, a giant composed almost entirely of the hydrogen and helium forged in the Big Bang, with only trace amounts of the heavier elements synthesized by the very first, even more massive population-3 stars. For millions of years, this star existed in a state of sublime equilibrium. In its core, a crucible of unimaginable temperature and pressure, gravity crushed hydrogen atoms together, fusing them into helium and releasing a torrent of energy that pushed outward, resisting the star's own immense mass. This was its main sequence, a long, stable period of stellar adulthood. The star was a factory of creation. As the hydrogen in the core was depleted, gravity compressed it further, raising the temperature until helium itself began to fuse, creating carbon and oxygen. The star swelled into a red supergiant, its outer layers expanding to a size that would have engulfed the orbits of Mars or even Jupiter in our own system. Within its heart, a nested structure of fusion shells formed, like the layers of an onion. In the center, silicon fused into iron. At each stage, the star created the fundamental building blocks of planets and life, transmuting the simple elements of the early cosmos into the complex atoms that make up our world. But the fusion of iron consumes energy rather than releasing it. When the core of the star became iron, the furnace at its center was extinguished. The outward pressure of radiation that had supported the star for millions of years vanished in an instant. In less than a second, the core collapsed under its own staggering gravity. The outer layers of the star, suddenly unsupported, began to fall inward, rushing towards the center at a fraction of the speed of light. They slammed into the newly formed, incomprehensibly dense neutron core and rebounded. This rebound created a shockwave of monumental power, a wave of pure energy that blasted outward through the star's collapsing layers. This was the supernova. In the fleeting, violent seconds of this explosion, conditions of temperature and pressure were created that exist nowhere else in the universe. The shockwave slammed into the shells of lighter elements, triggering a final, explosive round of nucleosynthesis. Neutrons, liberated in vast quantities, were captured by atomic nuclei, rapidly building up elements heavier than iron, the gold, the platinum, the uranium. The silicon carbide and graphite grains, the strange isotopes of xenon and neodymium found in the object, all were forged in this single, cataclysmic event. The star, in its death, seeded the surrounding interstellar medium with the materials for new life and new worlds. The light from the explosion would have briefly outshone its entire host galaxy. The object on the counter in the precinct was a direct descendant of this cosmic violence. The presolar grains trapped within its violet crystals were actual, physical fragments of that stellar cataclysm, microscopic embers from a fire that had consumed a star billions of years ago. The story it told was the grandest of all, the story of stellar death and cosmic rebirth, of how the elements that constitute reality are forged in the hearts of dying suns and scattered across the void to begin the cycle anew. The debris from the supernova, a shimmering, expanding cloud of incandescent gas and newly forged dust, did not dissipate into nothingness. Instead, it embarked on a galactic journey lasting hundreds of millions of years. It mingled with the interstellar medium, enriching it with heavy elements. It was pushed and pulled by the galaxy's differential rotation, sheared by the gravity of other stars, and sculpted by the solar winds of younger, hotter suns. This cloud of enriched material, a ghost of a star, eventually drifted into a region of the galaxy where gravity began to reassert its dominance. A nearby stellar event, perhaps another supernova, or the passage of a dense molecular cloud, sent a compression wave through this region, triggering its collapse. A vast, rotating nebula of gas and dust, trillions of kilometers across, began to contract under its own gravity. As it contracted, it spun faster, conserving angular momentum, and flattened into a protoplanetary disk. At the center of this disk, a proto-star ignited, a new sun, born from the ashes of the old. This was the alien solar system, the native home of the object. Within this swirling disk of gas and dust, the process of planetary formation began. The microscopic, pre-solar grains from the supernova, along with countless other particles, began to stick together through electrostatic forces. Tiny aggregates grew into larger clumps, which grew into kilometer-sized planetesimals. This was a chaotic and violent era. Planetesimals collided and merged, their orbits perturbed by the gravitational influence of their neighbors and the growing protoplanets. The object on the counter began its life here, as a fragment of one such planetesimal. It formed in a region of the disk rich in silicates, and the heavy elements from its stellar ancestor. The slow cooling in the near vacuum of the disk allowed the large, perfect violet crystals to grow, their structure a testament to this patient, low-gravity accretion. Deeper within this forming world, radioactive decay and the heat from constant impacts melted the interior, allowing heavy elements like iron and nickel to sink to the center, forming a metallic core. A subsequent, massive collision shattered this young planetesimal. A fragment, containing both the crystalline mantle and a piece of the molten metallic core, was thrown back into the chaos of the disk. It was this fragment, this piece of a broken world, that would eventually make its way to Earth. This entire process, the collapse of the nebula, the ignition of the star, the formation and destruction of the planetesimal, took place over tens of millions of years, in a corner of the galaxy so distant that the light from its sun would never reach us. It was a complete and separate genesis, a parallel story of creation unfolding in the cosmic dark. The object was therefore more than just a piece of a star, it was a piece of a world with its own geology, its own history, its own sun. It was a refugee from a solar system that may have gone on to host life, or may have been torn apart by its own violent dynamics. The object carried no memory of that fate, only the physical record of its own birth in a disk of dust and fire around a star that was not our own. For an unknowable period, perhaps hundreds of millions of years, the object existed as a small, unremarkable body within its native solar system. It orbited its parent star, its path a stable, predictable ellipse, one of countless such bodies in the system's asteroid belt. Its existence was one of quiet repetition, of long, slow circuits through the darkness, punctuated by the occasional, minor impact from smaller debris. Its history was written only in the slow accumulation of cosmic ray damage on its surface, a gradual tanning of its outer crystalline layers. The event that changed its destiny was one of gravitational violence, a disruption of the system's delicate orbital harmony. The cause is lost to time. Perhaps its star, at the end of its own life, swelled into a red giant, its expanding outer layers engulfing the inner planets and dramatically altering the gravitational field. Or perhaps the system suffered a close encounter with another star, a rogue wanderer passing through the galactic neighborhood, its gravity a tidal wave that tore through the planetary orbits, flinging worlds and asteroids into new, chaotic trajectories. Whatever the mechanism, the object was a victim of this disruption. A precise and powerful gravitational slingshot accelerated it to a velocity exceeding its star's escape velocity. It was ejected from its home, flung out of the shallow gravity well of its sun, and into the vast, empty expanse of interstellar space. Its journey began. For billions of years, it drifted through the great void between the stars. The light of its own sun dwindled to a mere point, then became indistinguishable from the countless other stars in its galaxy's sky, and then it too was left behind as the object crossed the galactic arms. Time itself seemed to slow. Its temperature dropped to just a few degrees above absolute zero. Its path was a near-perfect straight line, perturbed only by the faint, collective gravity of distant galaxies. It was a solitary traveler in an ocean of unimaginable scale. The silence of this journey was absolute, a perfect vacuum broken only by the whisper of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint, residual echo of the Big Bang itself. It was bombarded not by rocks, but by high-energy cosmic rays, protons and atomic nuclei accelerated to near light speed by distant supernovae and black holes. These particles were the only markers of its passage, leaving microscopic tracks of damage deep within its crystalline structure, a silent, cumulative record of its immense voyage. It was an orphan of its star, a messenger from a dead or distant system, carrying within its frozen heart the chemical story of its birth. Its chances of ever encountering another solar system, let alone a planet, were infinitesimally small. The galaxy is mostly empty space. But in a cosmos of immense timescales and countless stars, the infinitesimal sometimes happens. After a journey that spanned a significant fraction of the age of the universe, its lonely trajectory finally intersected with a faint, yellow star in a quiet spiral arm of the galaxy, our Sun. The capture was not a dramatic event, but a slow, inexorable submission to a new gravitational master. After its eons of linear travel, the object entered the heliosphere, the vast bubble of space dominated by the Sun's magnetic field and solar wind. It was moving at a high velocity relative to the Sun, on a hyperbolic trajectory that should have seen it swing past and continue on its interstellar journey. But its path was not empty. By sheer chance, its trajectory brought it close to Jupiter, the colossal guardian of the outer solar system. As it passed the gas giant, it underwent another gravitational slingshot, but this one worked in reverse. Jupiter's immense gravity acted as a brake, stealing the object's momentum and bending its hyperbolic path into a closed, elliptical orbit. It was captured. It was no longer an interstellar visitor, but a new, albeit highly eccentric, member of our solar system. For thousands, perhaps millions of years, it orbited the Sun on this new path, a long, looping ellipse that took it from the asteroid belt out to the distant realms of Saturn and back again. It was an alien in a familiar land, its composition a stark contrast to the native bodies of our system. Its orbit was unstable. Each pass through the inner solar system brought it closer to the gravitational influence of the other planets. Its path was slowly being altered, its orbit decaying. Eventually, the inevitable occurred. Its trajectory intersected with that of a small, blue-white planet, the third from the Sun. It entered Earth's gravity well, its velocity increasing as it plunged toward the surface. It hit the upper atmosphere at a speed of over 20 kilometers per second. The air in front of it could not get out of the way fast enough, and it compressed into a superheated plasma, a searingly bright envelope hotter than the surface of the sun. This was the moment of its second fiery trial. The object began to glow, first red, then yellow, then a brilliant white. Its outer layers began to ablate, vaporizing into a trail of incandescent gas that streaked across the prehistoric sky. The sonic boom from its passage would have been a thunderous roar, a wave of pressure that would have flattened forests and shaken the ground for hundreds of kilometers. This was the event that melted the terrestrial rock, the event that created the tektite glass. But the object was large and dense enough to survive the fiery descent. It decelerated rapidly, its light fading as it fell through the lower, thicker atmosphere. It struck not land but the surface of a shallow ocean that covered what would one day become a continent. The impact sent a colossal plume of water and steam into the air, and generated a tsunami that would have radiated outward for thousands of kilometers. The object, its cosmic journey finally at an end, plunged through the water and settled into the soft sediment of the seabed, coming to rest in the silent, crushing darkness of the deep. There its violent arrival was over, and a new, much slower chapter of its story, its terrestrial imprisonment, was about to begin. For an age, the object lay undisturbed on the ocean floor. The turbulent waters settled, and the slow, patient process of sedimentation resumed its timeless rhythm. The rain of marine snow, organic debris, dust, and the microscopic shells of plankton began to cover it. A millimeter at a time, a meter per 1,000 years, new layers of Earth's history slowly entombed the visitor from another star. It became part of the geological record, a single anomalous data point in a stratum of limestone and shale. As it lay buried, the world above changed beyond recognition. The continents continued their slow, tectonic dance. The ocean it had landed in began to close, the seafloor beneath it subducting under an adjacent continental plate. The object, now encased in kilometers of sedimentary rock, was carried along with it, drawn deeper into the Earth's crust. The heat and pressure increased once more. The surrounding limestone recrystallized into marble, the shale into slate. The object itself was stable, its dense structure resisting the metamorphic forces that transformed the rock around it. It was a prisoner in a stone cell, migrating slowly through the planet's interior. This geological journey lasted for hundreds of millions of years. The process of subduction eventually gave way to a continental collision. Two landmasses crumpled together, and the immense pressure forced the deeply buried rock upward, creating a new mountain range. The object, locked within its stratum, was lifted from the depths, rising slowly over eons as part of the growing mountains. Then, the forces of erosion began their work. Wind, water, and ice began to dismantle the mountains as soon as they were formed. For millions of years more, glaciers scraped away at the peaks, and rivers carved deep canyons, carrying the rock, grain by grain, back to the sea. The object's stone prison was gradually stripped away. Eventually, after a journey through space, and a second journey through the solid Earth, the rock layer containing the object was exposed to the light of the sun once more. Freeze-thaw cycles fractured the rock around it, and a heavy rain finally washed it free. It tumbled down a mountainside, coming to rest in a riverbed, its composite surface scoured and polished by the water and gravel. Its recent history was a cascade of pure chance. It was dredged from the river as part of a sand and gravel operation, its unusual nature going unnoticed among tons of ordinary rock. It was used as landfill, buried again, this time in a shallow grave of human refuse. Years later, an excavation for a new building complex churned up the soil, bringing the object back to the surface, where it lay in a pile of construction debris. It was there that the final, most improbable agent of its journey found it. A stray dog, foraging for food, was drawn not by a scent, but perhaps by the object's strange, smooth texture or its unusual density. For reasons that will forever remain inscrutable, the animal picked it out from the rubble, placed it carefully in a discarded trash bag it found nearby, and began its quiet, determined journey through the city streets, a journey that ended under the flat, fluorescent lights of the precinct station. The silence that filled the room was no longer born of simple confusion or procedural uncertainty. It had evolved, deepened into a state of profound, resonant awe. Miller, Chen, and Thorne stood around the counter, their individual identities momentarily submerged in a shared, contemplative state. The object sat between them, a nexus of timescales and spatial scales that dwarfed the human condition. In the sterile, ordinary setting of the police station, a place designed to process the mundane traumas and transgressions of a single species on a single planet, lay a physical testament to the universe's true scope. It was a supernova's ember, a fragment of a lost world, an interstellar pilgrim, a geological prisoner, and finally, a piece of municipal refuse. Every stage of its existence was a story of such immense scale and improbability that it defied easy comprehension. The two officers, men accustomed to thinking in terms of minutes, hours, and the immediate, tangible chain of cause and effect, were now confronted with a chain of causality that stretched back billions of years and across thousands of light years. The object didn't just challenge their understanding of the world, it shattered the very framework of their perception. The city outside, with its sirens, its dramas, its pressing concerns, seemed distant and suddenly, strangely small. Their own lives, the very history of their species, felt like a fleeting, momentary flicker against the deep, dark backdrop of the object's journey. Dr. Thorne, the scientist, felt it most acutely. She saw not just a rock but a library of cosmic data. The isotopic ratios were a language, the crystal structures a grammar, the presolar grains a set of ancient, holy texts. It was a Rosetta Stone, not for translating human languages, but for translating the fundamental processes of the cosmos itself. It offered answers to questions astronomers had been asking for decades, and it posed new questions they hadn't yet thought to ask. It was a career, a lifetime of study, sitting on a Formica countertop. The silence was the only appropriate response. Words were inadequate. Any attempt to label the object, evidence, artifact, rock, felt like a profound understatement, a diminishment of its true nature. It was a messenger that had traveled through deep time and interstellar space, passing through the heart of a dying star, the chaos of planetary formation, the crushing pressures of geology, and the random currents of human industry, to be delivered to this specific place at this specific time by the most unlikely of couriers. The silence was an act of listening, an attempt to absorb the sheer weight of the narrative it embodied. It was the quiet reverence one feels in the presence of something ancient and sacred, something that connects the immediate, tangible present to the vast, unknowable past. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady, electronic song, but the room was no longer just a room. It had become a cathedral, and the object on the counter was its altar, a silent preacher of the epic of creation. And the three human beings stood before it, their thoughts turned outward to the stars, their world, and their place within it, irrevocably and forever expanded.